grade teacher collected a group of well-known proverbs. She gave each child in the class the first half of the proverb and then asked them to fill up the remainder of the proverb with their own words. Here are the top 10 results from this fourth grade class. Better safe than punch a fifth grader. You can lead a horse to water, but how? Don't bite the hand that looks dirty. A miss is as good as a mister. I thought that was good. You can't teach an old dog new math. If you lie down with dogs, you'll stink in the morning. Makes sense? The pen is mightier than the pig. Two's company, three's the musketeers. Number 2, laugh and the whole world laughs with you. Cry and you have to blow your nose. And finally, the top answer from that fourth grade class, children should be seen and not spanked or grounded. Children have a different perspective on things. Sometimes it can seem funny, sometimes it can seem childish, the way that they think about things. Sometimes it can be brutally honest. They live in their own world, it seems to me, children do. One of the hardest tasks of parenting is deciding when and how to bring children into what we call the real world. The real world was introduced to me when I was 4 years old, and it was signified by a row of cans: beans, peas, potatoes, tomatoes, whatnot, set alongside jugs of water as they lined the cement stairs down to our unfinished basement in Waupun, where I grew up. I think many homes had a similar stash of emergency rations in their own basements during that time. Did you have it in yours? They were our provision in case of nuclear war with the Soviet Union. They seem absurd now, right? I mean, like the schoolroom drills to duck and cover under our desks as the bomb went off overhead. But my parents put them up as a concession to the real world. They were our constant reminder as we scrambled down the stairs to get some toys or to play ping pong with one another, that a real world existed alongside our childish one, a world of danger and possibly terrible destruction. For Colonel Harry Shoup, his constant reminder of the real world was the second of 2 telephones at his desk at the Continental Air Defense Command, now known as NORAD. The second phone was the red phone. Only a 4-star general at the Pentagon and Colonel Shoup himself at NORAD knew the number to that phone. And that phone would ring for only one thing: to let him know that there had been a nuclear attack on the United States. Well, one December day in 1955, the red telephone on Colonel Shoup's desk rang. You can imagine the wave of emotion that went through Harry Shoup as he answered that phone with a brave, "Yes, sir." From the other end of the phone came a small voice asking, "Is this Santa Claus?" This is a true story. As Harry Shoup's children tell the story, their father was annoyed and upset by the call, thought it was a joke, a prank. But then the little voice started crying. And Dad realized it wasn't a joke, his daughter said later. So he talked to him, he ho-ho-hoed, and he asked if he'd been a good boy, and finally he asked, may I speak with your mother, please? And the mother got on and explained, "There's a phone number in the newspaper to call Santa. It's in the Sears ad." And Colonel Shoup looked it up, and sure enough, there it was. But Sears had mixed up 2 numbers, and instead of listing the Santa hotline, they had inadvertently listed one of the most secret and sensitive phone numbers in the entire country, the NORAD red phone. And back at NORAD, Children were calling one after another on the red phone. And Colonel Harry Shoup did the only thing he could think of. He put a couple of airmen on the phones to act like Santa Claus. The airmen probably thought that Colonel Shoup had gone out of his mind, but they were also secretly pleased. At the command center, they had a big glass board containing a map of the United States and Canada in which they would track the movement of warplanes. But on Christmas Eve of 1955, when Colonel Shoup came in that night, on the big glass board was a drawing of a sleigh with 8 reindeer coming over the North Pole. His children explained some more. Dad said, "What's that?" And they said, "Colonel, we're sorry. We're just making a joke. Do you want us to take that down?" Dad looked at it for a while, and the next thing you know, Dad had called the radio station and had said, "This is the commander at the Combat Alert Center, and we have an unidentified flying object. Why, it looks like a sleigh." And the radio station called him every hour and said, "Where's Santa now?" And that's this true story of how an amazing institution started. It started with a Sears ad which instructed children to call Santa on what turned out to be a secret military hotline. It started with Colonel Shoup's sense of humor and some airmen who understood that the joke wasn't really a joke at all. And it's continued to this very day. On Christmas Eve, kids can call 1-877-HI-NORAD, 1-877-446-6723, to talk to NORAD staff about Santa's exact location. Or you can visit the www.noradsanta.org website throughout December for games and activities. I can only imagine that the prophet Isaiah would have been pleased. "They shall beat their swords into plowshares," he wrote. And if the technology had been around back then, he would have added, "and turned their war game command centers into Santa trackers." And Isaiah might have asked us this: did Colonel Shoup live in the real world, or was he starting to live in the world that God was bringing into being? There are so many ways that you and I have been told to fear, to give up our dreams, our ideals, to let go of hope, of aspiration, become part of the so-called real world. Especially we were told it when we were kids, growing into youth and adulthood. But of course those old cynics were lying to us. They told me that I would grow up and lose my ideals and adjust to the world as it is. I didn't. I haven't. Thankfully, by the grace of God, I haven't lost my youthful ideals. I've lost my childish faith in the so-called real world. As William Willimon wrote, "What serious people call reality is mostly a fraudulent mix of secular superstition and the platitudinous truisms of old men who stopped thinking scarcely 10 years after they graduated from college." It's odd that people with ideals, those of us who are still able to dream of something better than merely the present arrangements, should be considered naive. It's those who are adjusted to the present, who feel no restless discontent with things as they are, who are simple and naive. Their childlike satisfaction with the present is the true and sad naivete. We heard some real-world rhetoric this past week from former President Obama as he cautioned those now running for office to be rooted in reality and not to get too far ahead in their policies that they become out of step with the voters. Remember the real world, he might have been saying. Particularly when it comes to issues like immigration, he added. It made me wonder if the real scandal lies not just in our nation's present immigration policies, but in the ones we have long practiced in this nation. I also wonder if President Obama would have advised Isaiah to advocate beating swords into smaller swords. Get over it, the real-world presidential chief of staff said recently about mixing political favors with foreign policy. It happens all the time. So much for Republican Senator Vandenberg's childish vision in 1946 of having politics stop at the water's edge. Though Vandenberg's vision led to some very real bipartisan world to come accomplishments like the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The real world. I don't know about you, but I've had enough of it. I've had enough of it. As Albert Einstein said, reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. More recently came these intriguing words from Martin Maloney. If anything is poisoning our lives and weakening our society, it's reality, not the fabrication of television writers and producers. What does he mean by this? Well, I believe that all this real-world talk makes us far too easily resigned to things being the way they are instead of imagining the way they could and should become. The adult realist, the determinist, the mechanist, the modern materialist. These are the words they use for themselves. The nagging cynic who implores us to live in the real world is in a prison. And they always have a stake in keeping us in that prison with them. Whether it's a community built on inequality, an oppressive workplace, a bullied classroom, a frightened family, or any kind of abusive relationship. Live in the real world means that we live under their rules, under their power, under their thumb. We've had enough of them, haven't we? Let's give up on the real world. And instead, let's start thinking like children again. Not a bad idea, since Jesus informed us of God's attitude. I don't want adults. In my kingdom, I want only children. Young, expectant, eager children with 5-year-old eyes, old, bent-over children with fresh vision, little children, big children, boys, girls, women, men, all only children. And like children, let us recapture the capacity to dream, to see something more than what is real, something more real than simply that which is right now. Emily Dickinson put this attitude best. To make a prairie, it takes clover and one bee, one clover and a bee, and reverie. And reverie alone will do if bees are few. In our reading, Isaiah shares God's reverie, God's dream, in pointing us toward a new heaven and a new earth, which is new in the sense that is not yet fully our present heaven and earth, yet old in the sense that this is what God has always intended for our world. A shoot shall come out of the stump of Jesse. The wolf shall live with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the kid. The calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. This dream is of a war-torn world in which there will be only peace. A dream in which animals which normally devour one another will love one another. Isaiah says that this vision is a signal to the nations in which all the world shall see that God is great, that God is active, that God intends to have God's gracious way with this world. We leave the real world behind, it seems to me, when we gather here every Sunday. We ponder the poetry of Isaiah. We pray that God will give us the eyes of children, eyes able to see the advent of God among us, and that we shall be part of that incoming kingdom. That is not what we are to do, but a vision of what God is doing. We are not so much asked to do this, but rather to dream it. In this dream is our hope, and in this hope is our redemption. Colonel Harry Shoup, long after he retired from NORAD, carried with him always a briefcase. When he was in his 90s, he carried this briefcase that looked for all the world like the political football, under lock and key, the nuclear launch codes. What was in the briefcase really? Letters. Letters from people all over the world saying, thank you, Colonel Shoup. Thank you for the Santa tracker. Thank you for your sense of humor. Thank you for doing this wonderful thing for our children. Colonel Shoup was an important officer carrying out important military missions throughout his career, but he understood what was the most precious, most important thing about his life, the day on which he left the real world and took part in the world to come. And in that world, they will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Amen.